Half a Jerk Syndrome, a story by Ciro Discepolo. Less than a month has passed since my tragic trip alongside Metsa Puneta, and I am back in Russia, Siberia with a fear that I didn't have before, and that I can only define as the Metsa Puneta syndrome. Personally, I'm anything but paranoid, and as far as airplanes are concerned, nothing scares me. Not even a 10-hour trip in the middle of a very strong perturbation with continuous air pockets of hundreds of meters at a time. I can even say, without fear of being contradicted, that they are an anti-anxiety for those traveling with me. If they allowed me, and if there was an adequate technical means to allow it, I would fly hanging from the plane to be able to take interesting photographs. In other words, for me, flying is like taking the bus in the city. But since that tragic day, I am now afraid of who will end up next to me, and I'm considering the possibility of choosing the aisle seat, not only for very long flights. For flights up to 4 to 5 hours, I have always chosen the window seat. First of all, because I like to look with awareness at the space below me, comparing it to the geographical map of the world that I know quite well, even in terms of latitudes, longitudes, time zones, most likely routes, and so on. Furthermore, from the window seat, I can take some photos and avoid the annoyance of having to get up often if the person sitting next to me has prostate or bladder problems. However, as I was saying, after the episode in question, I am rethinking this a choice, and if I were to have another funny guy, like the one on the Moscow-Malpensa flight, I really think I could at least have the chance to get up, walk away, and travel, standing for the entire duration of the flight. Last night, I flew the first 4 hours back from Novosibirsk to Moscow, and obviously I was quite worried. I came across a gentleman 7 to 8 years older than me, 7 to 8 real years, and next to him another gentleman of the same age. I asked to be let through, and he kindly replied something in Russian, to which I replied in English, and he did the same in much more fluent English than mine. I sat down and thought to myself that it was normal. Well, normal, but obviously there's not even one normal person in the world, because thank God we are all wonderfully different, except Bossetti's unknown stepbrother, who according to his lawyers is the real murderer of Brimbate di Sopra, and even has the exact same DNA as the subject. However, within an ideal perimeter of common sense and with a certain approximation, we can certainly say that there are many normal people. That is, people who don't give you a syndrome after a few hours spent as your airplane seat neighbor. However, it didn't take a whole hour to discover that my neighbor, who was also an educated and cultured person, wasn't that normal. At the beginning, he was immersed in an intense reading of the newspaper, and this made him indistinguishable from the majority of Russian citizens who, as everyone knows, are formidable readers and love books and newspapers like we love football. As I was saying, it didn't take me long to understand that I had at my side a compulsive subject aggravated by a strong anticipatory anxiety and a mental attitude on the Excel model, strong Virgo values, for those who hadn't understood. Evidently the reading captured him so much that it hypnotized him, and this left him dormant in relation to the other travelers. But after the first 10 minutes of the flight, he began to produce a series of strange things to which at first I didn't know how to give a name, also because I didn't know that the professor, as I immediately christened him, was preparing for the meal according to different methods, all already written in his mental Excel sheet, of which he was the perfect executor. The first of these oddities was also the biggest. Suddenly, in a flash, I had the impression that my seatmate was taking off his trousers with a semi-submerged maneuver. A trickle of cold sweat ran down my back, and I thought, "Here we go." Then I realized that the semi-submerged maneuver with the bottom sliding down towards the floor of the aircraft was to wear in the best possible way from the knees to the stomach an entire double-folded newspaper, and to protect it from any splashes of the impending dinner. Being a precise, as well as compulsive and driven by anticipatory anxiety, he did this well before the time for food arrived, and, indeed, as if he were reciting a script rehearsed and memorized many times, the Excel sheet mentioned above. Usually when I travel by plane, I keep my eyes closed and use the flight time to think, but obviously not knowing what surprises this person had in store for me, I was careful not to keep my eyes closed, and in order to avoid surprises from risky conversations, I immediately put 2 earphones in my ears and started listening to music, also pretending not to notice what he was doing. I always start from the idea, in fact, that if someone doesn't harm you too much, it's not kind to put them in greater difficulty than those that characterize them. The compulsiveness consisted in the fact that our man was continually moving the newspaper, as if he wanted to find a perfect and all-proof position. The other gentleman next to him, a colleague, I think, was probably repeating a year, and gave the impression of not noticing anything, immersed in his turn in reading a text on a Kindle. In the meantime, my neighbor was adding a second newspaper to the plastic compartment that was already open and ready to receive the small tray that they hadn't started distributing to anyone, which didn't stop the professor from carrying out a whole series of tests and simulations to avoid any possible unforeseen event. To this end, he moved the small shelf closer and further away numerous times without ever reaching a satisfactory distance. It should be clarified right away that the subject didn't seem to me to be suffering from the onset of Alzheimer's or Parkinson's symptoms at all. He was wide awake and lucid. He responded to every external signal, such as announcements on the loudspeaker, very quickly. He had very quick and clear reflexes, and his hands or fingers didn't tremble in the slightest. I'd already eaten before boarding, and so I made this important step of the trip easier for him, perhaps the most important of all. Finally, the flight attendant came by asking for a drink before lunch or dinner. It was around 6 p.m. The professor had 2 glasses of orange juice served to him, and then he began a whole act that consisted of moving, inverting their positions, the 2 glasses placed at the 2 extreme sides of the table. Sometimes he drank from the glass on the right, other times from the one on the left. Then he drank 2 small sips from the same glass and did the same from the other. Someone might have thought that he was moving randomly, but I, who never missed a single movement out of the corner of my eye, could testify in court that the whole ritual obeyed precise positions in the cells of the Excel sheet that I understood to be the absolute director of all his performances. The moment when one of the 2 glasses remained empty should have reassured him a little, because, as was now completely predictable, our man immediately stacked the glass with liquid still in it inside the other empty one. The flight attendants were still 3 rows away from us. Then came lunch, which you can already imagine in some way, and where I must point out all his sensitivity towards others, his desire not to harm others, the awareness of not having to occupy other people's space, all things that almost always travel in parallel with anticipatory anxiety. With his elbows tight on his sides and his head lowered almost to the inside of the food trays, the professor ate with great appetite, almost voraciously, but also avoiding the slightest splash to himself and his two neighbors. All this with a frenetic, convulsive game of further adjustments of the newspaper on his legs and stomach, and of the other newspaper placed to protect the mobile table. Once the meal was finished, he began, obsessively and repeatedly, to lift each tray to check if there was any food or stains underneath them. It should be noted that during the meal, he had refused any drink for the reasons you can imagine. Then once he had finished eating, as a good Russian who loves literature and tea, he had a paper cup brought to him with tea, precisely, and he was very careful to keep the small tray with the trays on the far left of the table and the tea at the other end, continuously checking that the distances were respected. Here, too, he remained very agitated until he was able to return everything and check several times that there had been no damage. At this point, for the first and only time during the trip, I saw him relax a little, and the Excel sheet reminded him that it was time to speak. Up until that moment he had not spoken to his colleague. Then suddenly he began to speak to him like a river in flood, and even turned all the way to the right to speak better. The other participated and every now and then smiled because I think he already knew that script. Then, in a similar way, he went to pee, I think exactly a kilometer away, like Verdona's character Furio. Then followed about 15 laps along the entire plane, and finally he prepared for landing. He took out a plastic bag from which he took out his shoes. I hadn't noticed he was wearing slippers, and the shoehorn. He put the slippers away and put on his shoes. Then he began to dress more heavily, even though we were coming from the Siberian cold and were about to disembark in the warm heat of a Moscow at 0 degrees. Jacket, fur hat, scarf, and he wanted to get up before the plane even touched down. At this point I thought of him with sympathy, but I also thought of something else that I could summarize in a lovely and well-known quote adapted for the occasion. Every flight is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.